Ever feel like you're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but like all the pieces look almost the same?
Yeah, I can definitely feel that way when you're tackling something complex.
Well, the deep dive, that's what we do. We sort through those pieces and hand you the important ones, the ones that lead to those,
Hmm.
aha moments.
Exactly. And today, that puzzle is all about how work is changing. We're looking beyond that traditional 9 to 5 employee setup.
Right. It's a hot topic, especially with all the recent legal discussions.
It really is. And we've got some solid sources to work with today. We're looking at actual decisions, deep analyses from Brazil's Supreme Federal Court, the STF and the regional labor courts, the TRTs.
So this isn't just theory. This is based on how the courts are actually interpreting things on the ground.
Precisely. Our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to untangle all this, give you a clear picture of the different work relationships out there.
We're focusing especially on those company-to-company service agreements, Pejotização,
All right.
and other kinds of flexible work. When are they okay, and when do they cross the line?
Yeah, we want to bring clarity, without getting bogged down in dense legal speak, so everyone can really get the core ideas.
Okay, sounds good. So before we dive into the newer stuff, let's set the stage. What does a traditional employment relationship actually look like under Brazilian law? What are the essential ingredients?
Good place to start. The Brazilian labor law, the CLT, spells this out pretty clearly. Articles 2 and 3 are the key ones here, as several sources mentioned.
Okay.
Think of it like as a checklist. For it to be employment, legally speaking, you need a few things happening all at once.
Right.
It has to be a person, a physical person, doing the work themselves. That's personal performance.
Okay, personal performance.
They have to do it regularly, not just, once in a blue moon, so non-occasional basis.
Got it. Regular work.
And crucially, they have to be under the direction or control of the employer. That's the subordination element.
Ah, subordination. That sounds key.
It is. And finally, they have to be getting paid for it. That's called onerosity.
So personal, regular, subordinated, and paid.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to have one or two.
Nope. You need all of them.
Yeah.
Every single one. If even one is missing, technically it's not an employment relationship under the CLT.
Okay, that's super clear. All 5 elements must be there.
Exactly. And knowing that checklist helps understand why the courts are now recognizing other ways people can work together.
Which leads us nicely into this big shift we're seeing.
Yeah.
The old model is being challenged, and these flexible arrangements are, well, popping up everywhere. What's behind that?
A really big driver has been a series of quite significant decisions from the STF at the Supreme Court.
Right. You mentioned some case codes.
Yeah, things like ADPF 324, ADC 48, ADI 5.625, and RE 958.252, which is also known as TEMA 725.
Okay.
These rulings basically said, look, it's constitutional for companies to outsource pretty much anything.
Anything. Even their main business activity.
Yes, whether it's core to what they do, their activity FIM, or just a support function in activity mayo, that old distinction isn't the deciding factor anymore.
Wow, okay. So that whole debate about whether you could only outsource like cleaning or security but not the main production line,
Yeah.
that's settled.
Largely, yes. The STF really moved away from that. Justice Gilmar Mendes, for instance, pointed out that clinging to that distinction was actually hindering economic progress.
So.
It created a lot of legal headaches and uncertainty for businesses trying to adapt. So the main point from these STF decisions is that the legal system now officially recognizes other legitimate ways to organize work besides just hiring employees directly.
That sounds like a push towards more, well, economic reality, maybe. I think Justice Louise Fox had a view on this, too.
He did. Justice Fox made a really interesting point that labor rights and free enterprise aren't necessarily opposing forces.
Okay.
He argued they're actually interconnected.
Yeah.
And that giving businesses flexibility in how they structure production is, well, vital for Brazil's overall economic and social progress. It's about finding a modern way forward.
Okay, so the STF is basically saying there are other valid ways to work. This opens the door for things like Pejotização then. Can you paint a clearer picture of what that actually is?
Sure. Pejotização, at its core, is when a company hires another company, a legal entity, a PJ, to provide services, instead of hiring an individual person as an employee.
And often that service company is just set up by the person doing the work.
Very often, yes. So instead of being Jane Doe on the payroll, you're like Jane Doe Services Ltd, providing services under a contract.
And how does the STF generally view these setups? Our sources suggest they're often seen as okay.
Generally, yes. Cases like RCL 70927 and RCL 63946 show the STF tends to see these service agreements between two companies as lawful.
Even if the work is, like, central to what the hiring company does.
Even then, the STF has upheld these arrangements even for core activities.
But surely there's a catch. Can't just be a way to dodge employment laws, can it?
Absolutely not, and that is the critical point. For Pejotização to be valid, it must be genuine. There cannot be an actual employment relationship hiding underneath.
So what does that mean in practice? How do you tell the difference?
It comes down to those elements we talked about. Is there real subordination? If the hiring company is telling the service provider how to do the work, setting their hours, treating them like an employee, then it's likely not a valid service agreement.
So autonomy is key.
Autonomy is absolutely key. The contracted company needs to operate independently without that day-to-day control typical of employment.
It's about the reality, not just the paperwork.
Exactly. That RCL 70927 case you mentioned is a great example. The lower court initially looked at it and said, hang on, this feels like employment, even with the service contract.
Right.
But the STF stepped in and overturned it. They emphasized that it was an agreement between two capable businesses, and there wasn't enough proof that it was a sham, that it was actually employment in disguise.
And what about that beauty salon case? ADI 5.625. How does that fit in?
The Salon Parcero case? Yeah, that's another piece of the puzzle. The STF recognized these partnership agreements between salon owners and individual beauty professionals as valid non-employment arrangements.
So hairdressers, manicurists, working as partners, not employees.
Correct. Again, it shows the court accepting different models of work, provided they genuinely reflect that different kind of relationship, in this case, a partnership rather than employment.
Okay, so Pejotização and similar setups can be legal. But where is that line drawn? When does a service contract, maybe labeled PJ, actually become an employment relationship in reality?
That really is the crucial question, isn't it? While the structure itself isn't illegal, you absolutely cannot use it fraudulently, just to mask what is, in substance, an employment relationship.
So if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck.
Then the courts will likely call it a duck, regardless of the label on the contract. If those core elements of employment subordination, set hours, personal service, regularity, payment are actually present in the day-to-day reality, it should be recognized as employment.
And the STF itself has reinforced this.
Yes, very clearly. Even in that ADI 5.625 ruling about salons, they explicitly stated that if those employment characteristics are present, the relationship must be treated as employment, whatever the contract might say. Substance over form.
We saw some examples of this in the sources too, didn't we? Like that Natra consultant case.
Ah, yes, the Natra Consultant Orientadora C&O case. That's a perfect illustration. There was a service agreement, but the TRT found it was actually employment.
Why was that?
Well, the court found evidence of things like the consultant couldn't just send someone else to do her job. It had to be her personally.
Personal service.
Exactly. Plus, mandatory meetings, sales targets set by Natra, things that pointed strongly towards control and subordination, and a regular commitment, not just occasional work.
So the court looks past the contract to how things actually operated.
Precisely. It shows that the day-to-day reality is what matters most to the courts.
And didn't the software developer case, RCL 70927, also have an initial finding of employment before the STF weighed in?
That's right. Initially, the TRT did consider the software developer an employee. They looked at the continuous nature of the work and felt there was subordination, even before the formal PJ contract was signed.
But the STF reversed that one.
Yes, they did. The STF's reasoning focused on the formal agreement being between two capable legal entities, the developer's PJ company and the hiring company. And crucially, they felt there wasn't enough proof of fraud or clear evidence of that employment relationship continuing after the contract was properly in place.
So it seems like a really delicate balancing act for the courts, trying to respect freedom to contract, but also prevent workers from being misclassified just to avoid protections.
That sums it up well. It really hinges on whether the service provider's autonomy is real and provable.
Now, these sources didn't just talk about Pejotização. They mentioned other kinds of non-traditional work too. What else came up?
Yeah, there were a couple of other interesting examples showing this wider trend. One involved a commercial representative. The STF, again, citing those big decisions like ADPF 324 and TEMA 725, overturned a lower court's ruling that had found an employment link.
What was the key factor there?
A big part was that there's specific legislation, Law 4.88665, that actually governs commercial representation contracts between companies. So the court basically said, look, this is a recognized business-to-business relationship type supported by its own law.
So if there's a specific legal framework for that type of B2B contract, it strengthens the argument against it being employment.
Generally, yes. It adds weight to the idea that it's a distinct, valid arrangement.
And there's also a musician case with the singer Fagner.
Right. That one was handled by a TRT, the Regional Labor Court. They specifically said no employment relationship existed between the musician and the singer.
And the reasoning?
Lack of habitual work and lack of subordination. The musician wasn't on call. They only played specific shows they agreed to participate in.
So they had clear autonomy over when and if they worked for the singer.
Exactly. It showcased an individual providing services more autonomously, project by project, rather than under continuous employment.
We also saw that reference to something called Conjay-Jeezy. It sounded like a guide for companies.
Yeah, the Conjay-Z secure contracting method for service providers. It seemed like a practical framework for businesses trying to do this right.
What kind of advice did it offer?
It stressed doing your homework first, figuring out the right type of provider needed, whether it's a micro-entrepreneur, MEI, a small company, PJ, or just an autonomous individual.
Okay, diagnostics first.
Right. Then, having really clear contracts spelling out exactly what the obligations are, how things can end, clear communication lines. It even mentioned training managers so they understand they need to interact differently with a service provider versus an employee.
Interesting. So it suggests businesses are aware of the complexities and are looking for ways to navigate this compliantly.
It certainly seems that way. It's about being proactive to ensure these arrangements are genuinely non-employment ones.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, when courts are trying to decide, is this employment or something else, what are the absolute make or break factors they're looking at?
Well, it really comes back to those core elements. Autonomy versus subordination is huge. Who's really calling the shots on how the work is done?
Control.
Control, exactly. Then is the work regular, day in, day out, or more sporadic and occasional?
Habitual versus occasional.
Right. Can the person send someone else, or does it have to be them personally?
Personal versus fungible service.
And sometimes the courts try to gauge the genuine intent of the parties when they set things up. But honestly, if you had to pick the single most important differentiator, it's almost always the presence or absence of subordination. That's the linchpin.
That makes sense. So all of this obviously has big consequences, right? For businesses and for the people doing the work.
Huge implications. For businesses, yes, there's potential for more flexibility, tapping into specialized skills as needed, maybe greater efficiency.
But risks too.
Definitely risks. They have to be careful with structuring these agreements. The contracts need to be solid, and crucially, they need to ensure the reality doesn't drift into looking like employment. Otherwise, they could face significant legal and financial consequences later.
And what about the professionals, the individuals operating as PJs or autonomous workers? What's the trade-off for them?
Well, the appeal is often greater freedom, right? More control over your time, potentially higher earnings if you manage things well.
The upside.
The upside. But the flip side is significant. You're responsible for your own Social Security, your own health insurance, paid time off, all those benefits and protections that normally come with employment.
So you're essentially running your own micro business with all the responsibilities that entails.
Precisely. Professionals need to go into these arrangements with their eyes wide open, understanding both the potential benefits and these added responsibilities.
So if we were to sum up the main message from this deep dive, it seems like the world of work is changing, and the law, particularly in Brazil, is catching up. It's recognizing that there are valid ways to work together beyond the old employer-employee model.
That's right. As long as these alternative arrangements are structured correctly and genuinely reflect autonomy, they can be legitimate. It's about the substance, the reality of the relationship, not just the contract's title.
Yeah, the label doesn't matter as much as how things actually function day to day.
Exactly. And understanding these distinctions is becoming increasingly vital for everyone involved, companies trying to be flexible and compliant, and professionals navigating these new ways of working.
It really makes you wonder, though, with work becoming so much more flexible, how will our traditional ideas of employment itself continue to change? What does that evolution look like?
That's a big question.
And, what responsibilities does this shift put on both sides, businesses and individuals, to make sure these new ways of working are actually fair and sustainable for everyone in the long run.
Definitely some food for thought there. If you found this interesting and want to go deeper, I'd really suggest looking up some of those STF rulings we mentioned: ADPF 324, ADC 48, ADI 5.625, RE 958.252, or just exploring the specific laws around different work contracts in Brazil. There's a lot more detail to uncover.